Invocation of clauses rebus extantibus, writ of covenant, writ of deceit, writ of inquiry. Whereas the fundamental change of circumstances is now present in pure speech and the role of liberal constructionist Beetlejuice. It is my desirous willful wish to settle this matter fiat justitia ruat caelum denique ultimatum reveri reverum. A fraud revealed is null and void, nunc pro tunc ab initio et infinitum. Whereas my star contract, long-form birth certificate is in custody with the Office of the State Registrar and given under seal of the Office of the Great Seal, Lansing, Michigan, is claimed on the certified copy. My original copy has not been deposited in the lawful repository, namely the King's Exchequer as commanded by Richard I. It is my rightful duty to inform all parties, pirates who have laid fraudulent claim to my stock as per Black's Law, 9th edition West. Stock, now in 14th century, the original progenitor of a family, the person from whom a family is descended, where inasmuch subrogation is present. I am the stock of my mother, father, self-evident in the blood ether of my lineage veins, mitochondrial DNA, delta 9 Lucifer, delta 10 mDNA for my mother, which is prima facie evidence of my bloodline, RHA positive, where my father is the beneficiary of any all ascendants born to him. The father, semen, of any all born to him, render him the beneficiary only, whereas the mother is fiduciary. Word of Admiralty, a semen, so called because of the legal view that a semen in contractual matters should be treated as a beneficiary and the other contracting party as fiduciary because of the perceived inequitability of their bargaining positions. Whereas the surname is assumed automatic at birth, inasmuch as my mother adopted my father's surname upon marriage, my living blood was kidnapped by cesarean, and I was taken from my natural jurisdiction to be willfully enslaved into another legal corporate dead jurisdiction against my free will choice, jus praesens via deceptios via wrongful assumpsit. Whereas the mistaken assumption has been made that I am assumed in some way to be related to the crown, I attest this to be untrue, where the blood in my veins is mine, self-evident as living ether, without which I would cease to be, given to me by my mother, father. My father is the beneficiary of me, and my mother is fiduciary, where I am not the beneficiary fiduciary to them, nor do I claim any of their inheritance, where I am their inheritance, to which they are my heir, not the other way around. Based on this deceptios, my mother's father's inheritance as beneficiary fiduciary was stolen by those unlawfully claiming my mother's father's creation via deceptios. Furthermore, I laid no claim to my mother's father's estate, or may be mistakenly assumed to be beneficiary to any all titles, names, surnames, debts, liability, etc. at all, where I hereby invoke beneficium abstinendi ab initio et infinitum nunc pro tunc. Beneficium, a privilege, remedy, or benefit granted by law, such as the beneficium abstinendi, privilege of abstaining, by which an heir could refuse to accept an inheritance, and thereby avoid the accompanying debt. Beneficium abstinendi, privilege of abstaining, the right of an heir to refuse an inheritance and thus avoid liability for the testator's debts. Furthermore, my father's estate beneficiary status, as well as my mother's fiduciary status, has been willfully stolen via deceptios by any all parties, pirates, by any all use of my private name and birth vintage star date given to me, removed by way of kidnapping, shanghaiing me from my natural jurisdiction, where the question of the short-form birth certificate is prima facie evidence of this private to public fraud absolute, where my long-form birth certificate continues to remain unlawful until it is placed in a lawful repository. Any all use of this name in the public will be fraud ab initio et infinitum nunc pro tunc until lawfully deposited. The Office of the Great Seal, located at 320 South Walnut Street, is not a lawful repository, but is rather a customs bonding warehouse where true customs have been subrogated. Wade hearing, 1969, criminal law, pretrial hearing, which the defendant contests the validity of his or her out-of-court identification. If the court finds that the identification was tainted by unconstitutional methods, the prosecution cannot use the identification and must link the defendant to the crime by other means. United States v. Wade, 388 U.S. 218, 87, 1926, 1967, criminal law. Star, noun from Latin starum, from Hebrew shatar, or writing, history. A Jewish contract, especially for release of an obligation that Richard I declared to be invalid unless it was placed in a lawful repository, the largest being the King's Exchequer at Westminster, also termed stara. It is well known that, before the banishment of the Jews under Edward I, their contracts and obligations were denominated in our ancient records stara or stars, from a corruption of the Hebrew word shieh, a covenant. These stars, by an ordinance of Richard I, were commanded to be enrolled and deposited in chests under 3 keys in certain places, one and the most considerable of which was in the King's Exchequer at Westminster. The room at the Exchequer where the chests containing these stars were kept was probably called the Star Chamber, and when the Jews were expelled from the kingdom, was applied to use of the King's Council when sitting in their judicial capacity, for William Blackstone, Commentaries and Laws of England, 263, 1769. In summary, the ruse perpetuated on myself and mankind is exposed to the mistake it is, pure fraud ab initio et infinitum nunc pro tunc, Where it is now incumbent upon those responsible for this fraud to emendatio all mistakes created by this fraud, lest this mistake continue. All evidence has been collected where it is now present for use, such as my living blood ether, which is prima facie proof of stock, as well as the long form as yet unlawful connected to short form, proof of public fraud in my physical presence. By commission or omission of any all crimes, one is guilty where the crime is brought in view for all to see. Emendatio. Now, Latin history, the power of remedying and correcting abuses according to certain rules and measures. In conclusion, much knowing has been revealed to me in my own Genesis to Revelation, as my desirous willful wish to investigate the following. My original source contract is not deposited in a lawful repository. I have attached a photocopy scan containing my receipt, VC short form, so you may further investigate and inspect the following. The Terra Cross, dotted line covenant in the original source contract covenant, 19 ... My original source contract shows the birth date, star date was never corporate jurisdiction, dotted line passed through to private. It was never meant or intended to be made public. Short form fraud where this private matter is concerned, where my mother and father were removed from the short form, creating an abomination, dead corporate fiction. Therefore, the United States Crown Corporation and the state of Michigan, etc., falsely laid claims being related or joined to the estate myself, disposing the need for testatory capacity, creating a situation where they would be or benefiting from unjust enrichment by theft. The United States Crown Corporation and the state of Michigan, etc., are with unclean hands using false documents, moved me, kidnapped me as a child into a different unnatural jurisdiction, forcing me to pay their taxes, tariffs, plus levies, etc., creating much hardship for myself and all of my life, while another parties have been are benefiting from unjust enrichment due to this creation of literal slavery, with the kidnapping of me from my mother and father on June 28, 1983, 6 days after the prima facie evidence of my blood was already proved. The United States Crown Corporation and the state of Michigan, etc., removed my guest status, not allowing me to seek damages. The United States Crown Corporation and the state of Michigan, etc., falsely labeled the estate, creating a trademark, shanghaiing me into using it for identification, defrauding me in the laws and customs, forcing me to conduct trade while benefiting from unjust enrichment. I am submitting to your department a photocopy of the birth certificate, both forms to be used only for inspection in this matter. Should you require the original copy, please contact me. My signet is Chris, Divine Sovereign 111 at protonmail.com is the email. Clause the rebus extentibus, cross, the cross of air, a treaty provision stating that the treaty is binding only as long as the circumstances in existence with the treaty was signed remain substantially the same. Therefore, every contract created with the trademark is fraudulent, ab initio ad infinitum non pro tunc. I accept the full character of creator-creditor, toto genere. My willful intent is peaceful, as one wish for my guest status to be returned, as my wish to receive your assistance in full restitution emendatio. That's the long and short of it. Thank you. All references are from Black's Law, 9th edition, where many and further proofs are an addendum to this invocational writ. Addendum references Black's Law, 9th edition, West. Go through all these. This is all out of their Black's Law. Black and blue. Black Book of the Exchequer. Rules of Alaron. Excuse me, Black Book of the Admiralty is what I meant to say. All right, birth certificate fraud. Clause the rebus extentibus by humanity and we the people. Attention, lawyer, judge, government agent, employee, police, common man, etc. all. Any all who serve as a fictional legal name, title, identity, pronounced phonetically, example, leg, enemy, NME, tit, Luciferian character in the legal world reality. Author's note, where the author is defined as anyone who uses these words as theirs, the truth cannot be copyrighted, merely shared by agreement, and these words are theirs regardless of who wrote the words ab initio. Where truth belongs to all in conceptual, heart, mind, written, causal, not the physical, written form, effectual. Where this writing is written, spelled out in language understandable to both those in and out of the legal name fraud professional reality. Where the common understanding of this fraud and crime against humanity and creation is visible both in layman's and legal terms. Not to be confused by the intent of the reader, where the authors, the intentions thereof, their own intentions are crystal clear, i.e. legal world wranglers and twisters of hearings. Word is spelled out henceforth herein with all potentials of phonics deceptions, hereby and therefore removed ad infinitum. For example, a phonics deception is where one thing is spoken by a non-bar member, general public, and all legal name users without bar affiliation permissions, only be respelled differently by any all bar members under assumption or presumption to corrupt the original intent of the one speaking versus spelling it out, and why a fraudulent by deliberate design legal name non-bar member has no voice in the legal dead reality. In other words, one's words spoken cannot be altered from the speaker's original true intent as to what they mean versus what the one hearing the spoken form of the words hears and then corrupts them. and their spoken words by using alternative spellings under assumption presumption of the same sound homonyms, with completely different definitions, using this spelling trickery to undo them and gain the honor advantage where no honor in them exists. And the non-bar member is rendered in a state of perpetual dishonor unknowingly, i.e. twist them, the non-bar member speaking their spoken words spoken backwards, around, opposes, negates, corrupts the speaker's original intent to initiate and perpetrate, instigate fraud against them, to enable imaginary crimes to profit from statutory commercial rape, kidnapping, etc. at all. That's why court proceedings are called hearings, where spellings is a more precise term for what's really going on. Thus, this is spelling it out clearly, where assumptions and presumptions are rendered null and void, or where any all use claiming to be a legal name entity as everyone in the original sin sign state of fraud from the creation of and continued use of the legal name that appears in every birth certificate until they remove themselves from the criminal legal reality, or anyone involved in the enforcement of this fraud using violence, trickery, coercion, etc. to ensnare with intent to enslave another is, in fact, aiding and abetting a criminal act by forcing another into submission to its use, where this truth has been exposed, where it's illegal to use any all legal names, titles ab initio. Typical courtroom drama example: unwitting legal name, definite, mine, I do not consent. Spoken with the intent of no wish to consent, intended where the bar member, aka judge, lawyer, cop, etc., can and will assume, presume, in full honor the words phonetically as to how they want to hear it, and is respelled that verbal for bail. I do not consent, where I means yes, affirmative, and tacit agreement instantly. Do is in debt, tacit agreement. Not as in tied and bound, bond. Tacit agreement to slavery, and con means both with, for, and against, without. Equally is a prefix. Also means thief or criminal in common vernacular terms, etc. Say is Latin for himself, herself, itself, which is the entire essence of the speaker involved, and ent is a suffix meaning mind etymologically. In short, the ones perpetuating and profiting from this legal name fraud, deception can hear whatever they choose to hear, and can, will, in full honor, respell every word uttered at every hearing because it wasn't spelled out by the speaker in writing, where it can be respelled by the bar members' criminal intentions to incriminate all innocent and guilty individuals equally, thus painting all humanity with the same criminal brush they've been painted with, and simply passing the buck to make a buck of sin sign to another, rewriting by respelling the speaker's words against him to create the bar member's servant by oath advantage every time in every legal reality situation. This deception, ruse, criminal enterprise is over, where truth itself is all the vengeance one needs in a white flag state of truce, not surrender stance, and where all criminals perpetuating this crime against humanity are now fully exposed for all to see. It's illegal to use a legal name is a legal fact. Clause the rebus extantibus, as it pertains to birth certificates, any all contracts, treaties hereafter shown spelled cross or in full, commonly referred to as the escape clause. In legal public international law, clause the rebus extantibus, Latin for things thus standing, is the legal doctrine allowing for treaties contracts to become inapplicable, nunc pro tunc, where any all fraud revealed renders any all contracts null and void ab initio and infinitum, nunc pro tunc, tunc pro nunc, now for then for now, eliminating all time periods relating to the contract's existence in the first place, because of a fundamental change of circumstances, whereas it's illegal to use a legal name, birth certificate name, title, or the intent to create a fraudulent third party is evidence in any all birth certificates by the very existence of the birth certificate is self-evident. Cross is essentially and fundamentally proposed as an escape clause that makes an exception to the general rule of pacta sunt servanda. Promises must be kept, thus removing all prior previous assumptions and or presumptions, any all parties, legal and or otherwise to the contrary, where this fraud is revealed. Because the doctrine poses the risk to the securities, aka money, of treaties contracts for those profiting from this by design fraud, by exposing this intent to commit fraud and those perpetuating it, as its scope is relatively complete, unconfined, and without borders. It requires strict legal regulations as to the conditions in which it may be invoked, where only those claiming to be legal entities within the legal reality confines are concerned, and where one is no longer deemed a legal entity thereafter, since this is the last legal act in the common sense of the definitions of one who is formally deceived by the legal name birth certificate fraud, or is now known to be fraud, and where the ones invoking this clause no longer wishes to commit legal name fraud, any crimes against another whatsoever, while removing all traces of the former identity from theirs and everyone else's reality, regardless of aiding and abetting attempts of, by, for, in fraud by various crown corporation agents to elicit, force, demand, coerce, etc. Anyone all who is shown and stated otherwise. The doctrine is part of customary international law. But is also provided for in the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties on Article 62, fundamental change of circumstance, although the doctrine is never mentioned by name. Article 62 provides the only two justifications of the invocation of rebus extantibus. First, that the circumstances existing at the time of the conclusion of the treaty were indeed objectively essential to the obligations of treaty, subparagraph A, and the instance wherein the change of circumstances has had a radical effect on the obligations of the treaty, subparagraph B. In short, the intent to commit, aid, and abet fraud falls squarely on those perpetuating this legal name birth certificate fraud. Typically, anywhere anyone is being forced to enlist and pressed into service unwillingly, unknowingly, their child through registrations of any all forms ab initio, until dissolved or remains intact willingly by any all who continue to be guilty in their own fraud by willfully using any all legal names titles after the fact, where fraud absolute is self-evident, where this birth certificate fraud is in plain view. If the parties to a treaty contract have previously, currently, contemplated, known all facts regarding the treaty contract, based on a full and open disclosure from all parties involved in the birth certificate BC contracts, for the occurrence of the changed circumstance, the doctrine does not apply and the provision remains in effect, even though the full disclosure of the fraudulent intent of the birth certificate is a legal fact and is fully exposed to no legal fact within the confines of the fictional legal reality, whereas those continuing to use said treaty contract birth certificate legal name identity render this escape clause null and void by of their own hand in doing for willfully knowingly continuing its use after the fact, i.e. contempt of court, profiting from the veils of crime, etc. et al. Clause rebus extantibus only relates to changed circumstances that were never contemplated by one or more of the parties. Since one or more of the parties involved to initiate force and force fraud after the fact, such contracts, treaties as knowingly, unknowingly, ignorance is no defense, by, of, for, in, omission, commission, committing fraud with intent, regardless of claims made otherwise by any all who are legally dead, fictional entities, bar members, crown agents, etc., all using this fraud to steal the life source of another in any way, shape, or form. Although it is clear that a fundamental change of circumstances justifies terminating or modifying a treaty contract, i.e. the birth certificate contract is deliberately set up to deceive the gamete intrafallopian transferring party, male, female, creators of physical child, children, intellectual, spiritual names, with intent to transfer the living child, children, gamete intrafallopian, into a dead legal names word of admiralty state, placing all contracting parties in a state of fraud absolute collectively. A unilateral denunciation of a treaty is prohibited to any all legal name fraud participants, i.e. legal participants without bar, Crown Corporation member permissions, where the Crown Corporation agent's servant's intent to commit fraud is self-evidenced by the very existence of registration, hospital, etc. at all offices, trading in birth certificates, slavery. It must be done only on an individual choice basis to make this fraud known to any all Crown agents or remain knowingly fraudulent by the nature of the legal name constructed reality willing participant. Any all legal name fraud parties do not have the right to denounce a treaty unilaterally, i.e. on behalf of everyone involved, where a non-legal individual can, to expose, which exposes this fraud for all of humanity to see, where humanity must make its own choice individually, where the birth certificate is unilaterally deemed fraud upon all humanity notwithstanding. As a fundamental flaw and mistake of all legal proceedings, it is a legal fact in the legal reality fictional existence that it is illegal for anyone, everyone, outside of a bar card in which one must already be in fraud to enter law school using a fraudulent legal name is one example of fraud on fraud regardless, or sworn oath using a fraudulent with permissions granted only to titles attached to legal names likewise to serve the owners operators of the fictional Crown Corporation by willful and knowing, unknowing, omission, commission of fraud absolute. Consent to be, act as, lay claim to, act in the role of, etc. Legal name, legal entity, legal character as it appears in any all books of the registrar, registration, registry equals dead Crown family identity tree, whereby any all legal names, titles, designations, ranks, corporations, etc. all are in fact property of the Crown Corporation and use thereof without clear and explicitly present permissions by the legal owner or representative thereof, by and for said such owner of all such said legal creations is illegal in every way, rendering said user in a state of instant dishonor in the eyes of the court, a fraudulent felon criminal, regardless of the nature of any all accusations made by any all Crown Corporation representatives, bar card, sworn oath or not, since they are in the commission of a fraudulent act, i.e. CAFR accounts, bonds, etc. Here in this doctrine is spelled out for the reader receiver clearly, and their lack of understanding this doctrine renders them incompetent. Thus, everything they take is a mistake ab initio, where fraud is the intent of legal names fraud ad infinitum. Obviously, a criminal mind heart is incapable of rational thought, where a reasonable being, insane, simply looks for every reason under the sun to escape their own responsibility. By illegality is not reality legal means, and their complicity in these crimes against creation and truth until they decide otherwise. Simply put, criminals, destroyers of humanity, destroyers of life itself. In short, it's illegal to use a legal name, any all legal references aforementioned, regardless of claims made to the contrary by any all legal agents to the contrary, where legal agents is defined herein as anyone who uses any all legal definitions of who and what they think they are, a dead fictional character, no voice. Following this outline are only some examples of the total illegality of legal name fraud, where legal name, any all fictional legal entity formations, references, non-living paper constructs exist nowhere in any living conscious form outside of the confines of a dead legal reality, where one must speak or spell it into existence for it to exist at all. It is a fictional character reality that only exists in the minds of those that create said fictional characters, be they in a human, sentient, consciously aware form or any other inanimate, lifeless form, assumed presumed as living mental quantum, and can only exist between two parties in order for them to exist at all. And whereas the original fundamental nature construct of the treaty contract agreements has been altered, changed, fraudulent, and misleading intent by one or more contracting parties, and were intent to commit fraud, to deceive another, acting as frauds, liars, thieves, etc., criminal evil intentions, hiding behind legal names, titles, are is exposed by the very use of any all of these legalities, not reality, fictional constructs. There renders any all users of such things a felon criminal by deliberately deceptive design, and where I, the living creation, am not, nor will I be assumed and are presumed henceforth and forever a dead legal name, title, identity, ad infinitum, ab initio, nunc pro tunc, tunc pro nunc. 1. Legal name, title, construct, party claiming any all legal name, parties, third party interloping in on the birth certificate contract between Crown Agent and male-female wards of admiralty, where the legally enslaved child, i.e. the current legal names, identity, user, third party interloper, unknowingly was not present at the sinning of said birth certificate contract, nor were any details of this intent to commit fraud disclosure given to contracting parties, all participants, where a child and or children are involved. In short, the one using the legal name wasn't there at the signing of the contract, guilty of the original sin signed of by the father. Null and void, nunc pro tunc, contracting with the minor ensues, clauses of rebus extendibus is invoked, spoken, written. 2. A legal name, title, construct, participant is immediately guilty within the constructs of the legal unreality of Crown copyright infringement, where the Crown does not prosecute, meaning does not pursue deliberately for the only purpose of the continuation of humanity's overall fraud, which is far more profitable. In accordance with the warnings placed on various birth certificates, if it's on one contract construct, it's on all contracts constructs, based on the same non-reality of legalities, not reality, delusion, different in form, identical in conceptual intent, clause de rebus extentibus, and in subsequent certificates, aliases created by any all parties that use said birth certificate, proof of intent to commit fraud by its very existence, to create any all forms of identification from it, and or any all related forms, rendering said user an immediate fraud for doing so, or any all creation of any all forms of legal identification and any all legal definitions where this legal name's fraud is deemed mandatory by for of in the legal fictional reality construct agents, practitioners thereof, where force, coercion, deceptions, threats, thefts, blackmail, etc. is used to knowingly, unknowingly, by, of, for, and omission commission to enslave any all humanity, partaking in any all legal realms of fictional delusions, where the legal system demands humanity commit fraud in order to survive, as if one is presently was formerly using any all such said legal identification, where the fundamental nature of the birth certificate is to create fraudulent parties on both sides of the contract. In short, a license to kill, steal, cheat, etc. any all individuals as its primary intent. Clause de rebus extentibus is invoked, spoken, written. 3. It's illegal to aid and abet anyone knowingly, unknowingly, that is fully unaware of the legal name's fraud, deception, into a criminal activity against their wishes by forcefully, and any all ways includes trickery, violent actions, threats thereof that comply with fraud, means avoiding deceptions, etc., being assumed, presumed a dead legal name identity, where following orders by any all Crown agents is assumed, presumed authority based on deceptive, violent means and measures, to gain such fictional jurisdiction control over another by any all means of deception, where the intent to deceive another is self-evident by the very nature of legal names fraud, original intent by design by one who is titled uniformed in any all legal senses, legal unreality definitions, where the role to act in the character of any all Crown agents for the purposes of legal deceptions, aka commissions, as the basis of their jobs roles, namely uniformed officer, robe, judge, etc., whereas the emperor's clothes are removed. Their intent to do so, i.e. the very clothes, uniforms, robes, chains of office, etc., or to don any all robes, legal garments of the legal reality deems Crown agents easily visible and absolutely transparent For by of in the intent to commit fraud, aid and abet fraud, and the very act to don them. Clause de rebus extantibus is invoked, spoken, written. Profiting from criminal activity, employment, shares, profits, investments, sales, any all means of procuring legal fiat currencies, etc., inasmuch as any all commerce is based totally and utterly, utters of life, humanities, and milk and honey, on the legal name, title, fraud construct from the creation of fiat currencies based on the valuations of the slave trading bonds, UCC, UPU, aka Corporation of the City of London State, Corporation of Vatican City State, that the birth certificate is and intended to be for just such a purpose to involve every form of money made, be it through peaceful and or criminal activities, from being paid to deliver newspapers to being paid to legally murder another human being, under the legal umbrella of war military, where the murder in any form is murder, and any all associations to, by, for, of, in, any all legal names, titles, forms, renders one guilty by association absolute, and as much as one is still mentally, physically, spiritually bound in the legal reality, unreality, deal with the devil, Satan, by agreement to be so involved in this criminal activity. I don't associate with murderers, idol worshipping at any all levels, nor will I be assumed, presumed otherwise, by a legal name, fraud, associations, assumptions, presumptions, and illegal sorcery practitioners therein. Clause de rebus extantibus is invoked, spoken, written. 5. Any all individuals that use, claim to be, actively participate in, of, by, for the legal names, titles, in any all ways whatsoever, without explicit permission by their illusional legal masters, aka bar card, crown agent, sworn oath members, are practicing legal law, which is legal, not lawful, without a license, but are deemed to be practicing law, using legal commerce, anything in day-to-day living reality, where the legal name is a legal definition, within the confines of legal unreality reality, where lawyers are used to fill this gap in the illusion of legal representation, that renders any all who do so silenced, without voice, and are invoiced accordingly, as a word of admiralty, or essentially a child of the dead corporate body consumed phonetically state, until such guilt by legal name association is removed by the one being deemed to practice law sorcery, literally, by not using a lawyer to keep the court in honor, where now contempt of court is enacted upon any all who enter a court of man-made law, which places the crown agents, court officials, in peril of dishonor, where only the confession of the one entering, thinking they actually need to be there at all to be a legal name, are tricked into claiming anything that resembles, in part and or in full, anything that can bind them to the birth certificate contract spellings, as they appear on said birth certificate, that will ultimately render the user as a felon fraud first, thus restoring the illusion of honor in their court, where the ruse is perpetuated anon. Clause de rebus extantibus is invoked, spoken, written. These are just a few of the examples anyone with any sense of legal wrongdoing can see to illustrate clearly the absolute fraud nature of the entire legal system and the basis of the fraud against humanity it is based upon, where the legal name, title, claims are the cornerstone that holds the entire pyramid construct, with the criminals, legal sorcerers atop the pyramid of delusional and illusional power, and where any all cops, judges, lawyers, common people should have a basic understanding of what fraud is, where fraud is clearly defined in the Ten Commandments motif. Fraud, entire legal reality, includes, not limited to, murder, raping, stealing, adultery, greed, lust, covetousness, false auto-creation, and worship, and all manner of evil intentions, where only the veil of a paper reality protects the evil with knowing intentions. And now you know. Ignorance removed herein, which is incumbent for every individual to prove otherwise. Silence equates acquiescence. Maxim is invoked. Clause de rebus extantibus is invoked, spoken, written. Inasmuch as the Vatican, Corporation of Vatican City State, as commonly understood, is also complicit in this legal name, title, reality by virtue of legal registration, all spiritual notions of power are hereby nullified ab initio ad infinitum, where Vatican City is registered, as are all nations, countries, etc., all as registered crown-owned corporations, and are neutered by association accordingly, where any all assumed presumed power is fully and completely destroyed by, of, and for this legal name, title, complicit agreement, treaty, fraud, and is therefore complicit in this fraud against all of humanity and life itself, as are all claiming any all legal status in any all legal forms ab initio ad infinitum, nunc pro tunc, tunc pro nunc, any all actions made by anyone professing to be in, of, for, by, any all legal names, title, is fraud. Attempt to aid and abet fraud, where it is legal to use, be, claim, think, one is legally defined anything. You're served? No. The game is over, and Satan and his harlot, legal Cronus, commerce, crone, crown, lost all gains where all law was and is church-based. Where court is simply a synonym for church, and the living true law was placed with false dead legal and all road practitioners, whether court or church, serve the same dead legal reality and are rendered soul dead accordingly in the eyes of creation. Your soul is on the line lean, while your sin signs are on the lean line. Only you can clear your debt. No Savior is coming to save you, but rather to condemn you for all of your willful crimes, now knowingly being committed by the mere virtue of you having received this, having read it or not. While I got this open, we're going to also read, I who shall not be with legal name, hereby proclaim to all with unclean hands, just for good measure. There we go. All right. We'll also do the 10 Commandments, which is the true law at the end of this. I who shall not be with legal name, hereby proclaim to all with unclean hands. The whole system has unclean hands, which means they can't adjudicate anything because they're in dishonor. Be it now known that all words, spellings upon within this document shall be my will and intent only, without assumption or presumption on, of, by, for any all concerned, where my free will choice shall never be trespassed, for my intent is my intent and no others. Whereas a great fraud has been revealed and is laid bare, where unclean hands are now in the light for all to see, where any all with unclean hands must judge only self, toto genere. Whereas non-disclosure has intent to defraud in that act, any all contracts of body, mind, soul are null and void, non pro tunc, praeterea, ab initio, ad infinitum, in this willful intent to commit fraud by omission and or commission where others and all are concerned. And whereas threat of force perceived or real is proof inasmuch of intent inasmuch as aiding and abetting in this fraud, when where assumption and presumption is concerned, thus destroyed, and whereby one is known by their actions of that their willful intent, either knowingly or in ignorance of the divine laws under which all stand, and whereas all signatures, contracts, assumptions, presumptions, etc. at all are rendered null and void ab initio, inasmuch as all are in contempt, fraud, where the crown owned and copyright names Robert Ambrose Demetriou, Janice Elaine Demetriou, Nee Sutton, Christopher Robert Demetriou, Treva Lynn Demetriou, Nee Grimm, Danica Noel Demetriou, Chloe Renee Demetriou are concerned, and whereas the intent to commit fraud by deceptions, deceptios, and willful non-disclosure of truths were intent to enslave all humanity and mankind by church state, and this intent is exposed fully, whereby one's actions make one known, and whereas all names registered are in fact property of the Crown Vatican, all matters pertaining to such names registered and the use thereof renders all parties fraudulent in contempt by a willful intent to deceive, and or ignorance of use, where all matters of church state remain matters of church state, where use of the names registered are concerned, and where when third-party interloping is evident by my use or anyone's use of stated registered names, and where it is not my intent to commit fraud or any contemptible acts, it is also my equal intent to never aid and abet any other living soul by willfully knowing or in ignorance on and there my part, and any use of or claim made using the aforementioned names will render such attempt an act of fraud by willful commission, and whereas any all use of church-state identification based upon these all crown copyright names or any variations thereof renders the user in fraud absolute by their ignorance and by omission of disclosure of by church-state, and whereas any all claims made by any all parties, agents, living souls upon another willfully or in ignorance to do so, is guilty of fraud in that action by commission and or omission of bearing false witness, and is in contempt of church-state self, it is willfully aiding and abetting fraudulent deception, deceptios, whereupon judgment is rendered upon any all agents of church-state self, by the very action of claiming via crown copyright fraud, and inasmuch as intent, spirit must be proven where all are concerned, it is now incumbent upon the church state that the willful intent to commit fraud ab initio is without intent to do so. With prior knowledge, the agents, clergy, bar members, all bound by oaths, etc., to, of, by, for, with, church state did do willfully deceive humanity, and is by the actions of all bound to church state by oath sworn, taken, given, judged by, for, of, by, of, in all acts of harm upon any all harmed, and whereas fraudulent intent of all bound to church state entities, living souls, principalities is visible by omission and or commission by the actions of harm intent to harm of, for, by any all beings using a name in fraud ab initio, all claims made, coerced, assumed, presumed, etc. at all are in fact fraudulent at source of, for, by all claiming any all legal names, fictional identities, titles, etc. at all, and or thus any all forms, aliases are and are of, by, for the criminal intent to do so using the intellectual property of another living soul, spirit, or dead fictional entity where I am toto genere, spirit, mind, body, and furthermore to engage in such intently destructive acts of harm, deception, theft, coercion, etc. at all against another by any all means is shown by one's actions and need never be judged, whereby the act is the judge in of itself. Judge not, lest ye be judged, where assumption, presumption cannot, does not, will not exist after the act itself. And furthermore, any all registration, registering, register by omission and or commission, where full disclosure is not evident, the intent of church state, any all claiming such association, joinder, by means of willful oaths, signatures, cursive, titles, etc. at all, are in fact willful acts of predetermined fraud, knowingly or unknowingly, where wrongful obligations, curses, has, is, was the intent, where obligations is are replaced back upon those who knowingly or in ignorance of their fraud do so, ab initio et infinitum non pro tunc, preteria, and furthermore, it was never my intent to willfully use the property of another, whereas any all things registered are in fact claimed to be such intellectual property of another, namely church, state, crown, where my mother and father unknowingly were in ignorance, aided and abetted of their consent into such church, state contracts, be they all forms physical, physical, spiritual, mental, and furthermore, I place the onus on us back upon return to any all beings by virtue of their oaths, etc. at all, and self-judge in their acts, any all obligations created by any all contracts, where all contracts entered into based on this fraud, original sin, intent to defraud, or nullified, null and void, ab initio et infinitum non pro tunc, and furthermore, all obligations upon myself created by this fraud are void, inasmuch as the perceived, assumed, presumed gift, without consideration of any all names, is concerned in that a bond debt has been created in the form of a birth certificate with an assigned debt not value, where I was assumed, presumed to be that value, without void of my willful consent, where has been the willful intent of by for all parties initiating such acts of obligation upon this their debt, and whereas intent is clearly visible by any all who engage in acts of commerce, whore of Babylon, using the name, mark of the beast, has been, will be acting in fraud and creating harm, cannibalism against their fellow human beings, since all fiat currency is based upon aforementioned bonds and is guilty of human being trafficking of the highest order, and in defiance of creation, where consumption ensues, and whereas the willful intent from any all willful associates, members, oath beings of church, state, crown is evidentiary proof of by for any all acts perpetrated against another, where any all registered names are concerned, inasmuch as non-disclosure by aforementioned was never given, offered, where aiding and abetting in fraud is the intent, where any all aforementioned have unclean hands accordingly, and whereas any all registered things, possessions, are in fact property of the church, court, state, crown, copyright, or any claim made by any all not oath to the aforementioned are matters of church, state, court, crown, inasmuch as willful trespass and enticement into slavery by a third party interloping into such matters that do not concern me, the one who shall not be obtained, or my own customary calling is mine, shall never be given, and furthermore, by means of this birth certificate, long form, short form, deception, non-disclosure, willful act of fraud, the only documents ever willfully given as proof of intent to commit fraud, aid and abet fraud by, of, for, church, court, state, crown, etc. at all, and all oath bonded to willfully to such titles, fictions, corporations, where the claim is also made that the aforementioned take on the role of perceived parents patriae, embodiment of state, and are in fact kidnapped, abused, harmed any all who have been fraudulently claimed to be a ward of admiralty, where the mother is fiduciary, father is beneficiary, ab initio, and whereas the rights of both mother and father have been stolen by a non-disclosure and willful intent is proof by actions of those, by oath, willful applications, any all claiming to be of, for, by, church, court, state, crown, in the form of birth certificates, licenses, marriages, family names, taxes, registrations, etc. all, ab initio, therefore, is it the or willful intent of this, you, of, for, by, in church, court, state, crown, etc. all beings, living, dead, fictions, to coerce, by force or deceptive means, to have me incriminate myself, where I'm in full knowledge of this dual fraud, where willful intent to do so makes you and me guilty of an issue by claiming to own be something that has never been mine or yours to be your claim? Is it your, by oath entity, intent to aid and abet the furtherance of this fraud, cannibalism, child kidnapping, human trafficking, theft, etc. all, by fictitious acts in legislation, etc. all, by of for dead entities, by for of dead entities, dead carrying out the dead, where I am one of the living versus a fictional dead entity created by for of the church, court, state, crown, by enticing me via force, coercion, deception to be a surety for the church, state, court, crown created debts, whereas any all fraud by virtue of its intent and creation remains as such, regardless of length of time taken for such any all frauds to be exposed. All contracts are null and void upon its discovery, where a fraud revealed is in fact null and void. Ab initio, non pro tunc, where any all energy stolen in any all forms shall be returned, where the intent to commit fraud against me will be with intent. It is not, has never been, never will be my intent to willfully and knowingly commit fraud, where mistakes and ignorance by commission and or omission are present, and where any all acts of mine are not in contempt with temptation of anyone, anything, where any being choosing willfully to contempt me is now with intent to do so. All contracts, documents, signatures, agreements, etc. all are now null and void, where any all debt created by church, state, court, crown is forgiven, returned from whence it was created. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, where I am the non-contracting living with a debt bond identity that is the property responsibility of those which created it. It is furthermore the obligation of any all oath beings by, for, of the church, state, court, crown to return my energy, creation's life force, stolen via this original sin, intent to defraud my mother and father, where they aided and abetted in my own fraud, by means of deception, non-disclosure, where your unclean hands have been concerned. I seek no vengeance, I offer no judgments, and return the obligation of debt, forgiveness to those who would have deceived me, where a crime against all humanity is being perpetrated with willful intent and light for all to see. By one's actions, one is known and instantly judged in, of, for, by such actions, where the intent is laid bare for all to see, in, of, by, for, any, all such actions, whereas any, all beings willfully, by, for, of, commission, omission, are held and bound, judged of themselves. Act accordingly, lest ye be judged in, of, for, by oneself, yourself, fully. Toto Jeannery. 10 Commandments. And Elohim spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahuwah Elohika, which have brought you out of the land of Mitzrayim, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other Elohim before me. You shall not make unto you any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heavens above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them, nor serve them, for I, Yahuwah Elohika, am a jealous El, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and guard my commandments. You shall not bring the name of Yahuwah Elohika to naught, for Yahuwah will not hold him guiltless that brings his name to naught. Remember the day of the Shabbat, to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Shabbat of Yahuwah Elohika. In it you shall not do any work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahuwah made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Yahuwah blessed the day of Shabbat, and hallowed it. Honor your mother and your father, that your days may be long upon the land which Yahuwah Elohika gives you. You shall not kill, you shall not break wedlock, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not lust after your neighbor's house, you shall not lust after your neighbor's woman, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that's your neighbor's.